Hi, welcome to Microeconomics for International Management. Today we are going to talk about pure monopoly market. What are the features of pure monopolistic market? Look at the slide. We've got just one seller and many buyers. Many buyers is already explained. We said we are going to focus on such markets. One seller this time. This is the major difference when compared to perfect competition when we had many sellers, just one seller. Why is that so? Because of entry and exit barriers. They are so important, they are so significant here that they do not allow other businesses to compete with this only one seller, the monopolist, as we are going to call this business. Those entry barriers could be natural, could be artificial. For natural entry barriers, well, we already had some considerations when we talked about long-run costs. And we know that there are sometimes huge economies of scale. And those huge economies of scale, they do not allow for any competition. One business in the market is just enough. But we are going to focus on artificial barriers today because they are much more important. They explain more cases, actually, of monopolistic situations than just natural barriers. So we've got legal barriers to start with. Legal barriers mean that there is something in the legal system that does not allow others to compete. You can see it very clearly in the case of central banks. If you look at the central bank of your country, you will see that in the law of your country, there is a certain legal act that says money can only be produced and supplied to money market by the central bank. This is the only institution that can issue money, that can produce money. And if you try to produce your own money, then actually you commit a crime. So this is a legal barrier. Then we've got technological barriers. Technological barriers simply stem from the fact that we do have technology that allows us to do something, whereas others cannot have this technology. So if there is, let's say, one business that is able to develop, a vaccination against COVID perhaps, then we would say, well, this is this one business that knows how to do that. Others don't know how to do that, so they cannot compete. Economic barriers stem from the fact that sometimes it is economically difficult to enter a certain business, a certain industry. Economic barriers may be linked to technological barriers as well. Simply, technology may be so expensive that you cannot afford to buy it. This is possible. There are little problems with understanding what pure monopoly is about, and those problems stem from actually two issues. The first one is we need to remember that pure monopoly means there are no close substitutes to the product. So I mentioned the case of Insignia here, because Insignia is a model of a car that is produced by Opel. And as far as I know, there is no other business that could produce Insignia other than Opel. How often do you hear that Opel is a monopolist when it comes to producing insignia. Never. We don't call Opel the monopolist, even though this is the only business that produces this kind of car. This is due to the fact that there are many close substitutes to Opel Insignia. Not being expert on the automotive market, I know there are other cars that are kind of similar to Insignia. Similar when you look at their price, at their dimensions, how big it is, at the engine, its capacity, materials that are used. There are similar cars. Therefore, we do not call Opel a monopolist. It's a different story with Windows, for instance. Most of you use computers, and for those computers, the dominating operating system is Microsoft Windows. Do we happen to call Microsoft the monopolist? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Because, first of all, it's got a great share in the market. And secondly, for normal, average Windows system users, there is no close substitute. Obviously, you could try to switch, for instance, to Linux, but most of you wouldn't know how to do that, wouldn't know how to use such a computer, right? If you have an Apple computer, for instance, they have their own operating system, and again, you cannot actually get rid of it. So these are monopolists, right? These are situations, remember, when we do not have close substitutes. Perfect transparency of the market is the assumption that we already discussed talking about perfect competition. So just mention that we do apply this assumption here as well. And the second thing that makes some problems when it comes to monopoly, lack of close substitutes, was one of them. The other one is, where do we set the borders for the market? So this is always the question whether we look at monopoly or whether we look at oligopolistic market. So if, for instance, there is one national train company and they operate all the trains in the country, when you look at railway transportation, this company would be the monopolist. But when you think of transportation market, it is one of the major players, but not the only. Because if you want to go from Gdańsk to Warsaw, for instance, you can take train, but you can also take a plane, you can use a car, you can use a bus. So there are other options. Okay? So is it monopolist or is it oligopolist? This is always the question where we set the borders for the market. Some initial considerations with regard to pure monopoly. First of all, we need to acknowledge that there is equation between market demand and product demand. And this is different, very much different, from perfect competition market. In perfect competition market, market demand was downward sloping, whereas the individual demand for products was a horizontal line. That was due to the fact that one single business was just a tiny part of the market. But here in pure monopoly, market demand is at the same time the demand for products of the monopolist, because actually that's the only supplier. One single buyer has no influence whatsoever on business decisions of the monopolist. Therefore, we would say the monopolist is the price maker and not the price taker. In perfect competition market, we said one single business has no control over the price. In monopolistic market, the monopolist has the full control over the price, decides upon the price. But the question is the monopolist really free to choose whatever price level they want? Not necessarily, for two reasons. Reason number one, kind of institutional one. In many countries, actually in most countries, there is some kind of institution that monitors the level of competition in the market. And when there are some monopolistic businesses, some monopolistic industries, they monitor those markets very carefully. So the monopolist may have some limitations when it comes to pricing strategy, coming from some regulatory bodies, coming from some institutions. The second issue that we should consider here is our monopolist, even if we neglect the institutional factors, our monopolist faces some economic reality. The demand for their product is given. If the price is too high, then some or even most of people would give up on the product. What is the goal of the monopolist? Is it about setting the price very, very, very high? No, not necessarily. Actually, the goal of the monopolist, as for any other business, is to maximize the profit. So they would certainly try to push the price up because that is usually quite good for profit. But when they start losing customers, they have to stop increasing the price. Okay? So this is what we should remember here. In pure monopoly, the producer, the monopolist, is the price maker, so he creates the price, but some factors have to be taken into account when setting the price. So we are going to see what are they. Before we proceed to that, however, let's mention some additional features of the monopoly. So first of all, market price is not equal to marginal revenue anymore. They are kind of related, but they are not equal to each other. So this is the important difference between pure monopoly and perfect competition. What is kind of surprising is that marginal revenue can actually be negative. It can be negative because when you are the monopolist and you want to sell more, you need to decrease your price. Have a look at the graph. If you want to increase your sales in terms of quantity of products sold, then you need to decrease your price. And for those two levels of prices that you can see, you can find two corresponding quantities demanded, and you can find two corresponding total revenues. The first revenue would be the rectangle built on the higher price and smaller quantity. So this is this rectangle here. compare it with the second rectangle that is based on the small price and bigger quantity. Which area is bigger? The first one is bigger, which means if you decrease the prices, as in my graph, you will increase quantity demanded, but you will decrease your total revenue, which means marginal revenue will be negative. If you decide to sell more, then you would have to decrease your price, and in this way, additionally sold units will decrease your total revenue, not increase it. So this is an important difference. When it comes to cost curves, we wouldn't say there are any important differences here. The shape of the curves is pretty universal. I mean, it is kind of the same for perfect competition and monopoly. The only difference can be with regard to marginal cost. It is possible sometimes that this marginal cost in pure monopoly can be horizontal, can be flat. This is usually the case when the monopoly wants to have so-called excess capacity. Excess capacity means that the monopolist building their, let's say, factory decides to build this factory bigger than it is needed. This is due to the fact that monopolists usually try not to produce too much, not to supply too much to the market on one hand, but on the other hand, they like having possibility to significantly increase their production if someone wants to become their competitor, if someone wants to enter their market. Then they could block this market by rapidly increasing their production. Hence, this need for having excess capacity. And in excess capacity case, marginal cost can be flat. So this is different comparing to perfect competition. Look at total revenue and marginal revenue for monopolists. So let's start with the demand. We take the first graph here. This demand would be the simplest possible, I mean linear function of demand. And then you can see we find a certain quantity here and the corresponding price. And we've got another quantity and the corresponding price. We already know that those rectangles that you can see represent total revenue for each level of production or for each price that you see. We can try to analyze the changes in total revenues in the areas of those rectangles for different quantities for different prices. So what we are going to see is, first of all, let's consider the points of intersection between demand in the upper graph and the axis. So the first point of intersection, we've got a very high price, but the corresponding value of quantity is 0. So total revenue for this high price, the highest possible price, would be 0. The price is very high, but we don't sell anything. The second point of intersection, this intersection between demand and the horizontal axis of Q, would mean we could sell a lot of products here. But actually to sell them, the price would be 0. So we would give them for free. If we give for free, then we do not get any revenue. So for this quantity, the total revenue would again be 0. It would get to the maximum in the middle. So for the middle of the distance between the origin of the coordinate system and this maximum Q, right? And this is basically the shape, this is the curve of total revenue. As you can see, it starts with the 0, then it goes up, reaches some maximum in the middle, and then going down, hitting 0 again, right? This curve is symmetrical, right? So the maximum is just in between those two points of intersection with the horizontal line. So this total revenue curve here allows us also to show the curve of marginal revenue. Let's find the demand curve again. Let's focus on marginal revenue. Marginal revenue that can be treated as the slope of total revenue curve. So as you can see, the slope at the very beginning is pretty high, and then the slope gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And for the maximum level of TR, we've got 0 slope. So from the very beginning to the middle, we've got positive but declining slope. And after exceeding this maximum value of total revenue, we see the slope becomes negative, more and more negative actually. It's bigger and bigger. So this is what our marginal revenue would like. This is the line, right? So you can see it starts at the same point as demand, and it goes down. It hits 0 for the maximum of total revenue, marginal revenue being the first derivative. Therefore, if marginal revenue is 0, then total revenue gets maximum. And then after exceeding this maximum, the derivative would be negative because total revenue would decrease. So for the decreasing function, the first derivative would be negative. Marginal revenue can be negative. Something that was absolutely not possible in perfect competition. Here it is. Marginal revenue can be negative.